Kira, thank you so much for that introduction. Actually, with the news that we've had in New Zealand around the COVID situation, I do fear that many of our friends in Auckland, New Zealand, may not be looking at this at 6 o'clock, but when the news is released. But it's a real pleasure to be here for this presentation. Now, I will share a screen here so we can run through things. And what we're really going to look at today is relatively straightforward. And that is to try and understand or better understand the issues of organised crime as it relates to gangs. So I'll start off with very, very elementary history of gangs in New Zealand and why people join them. The rise of them as organised crime groups, and this really deeply embedded idea that they dominate the gang scene in New Zealand. And then I'm going to challenge that a little in a number of ways. Firstly, by presenting a case study where we really didn't get it right when we're talking about an evidence-led approach to policing, and also a couple of fundamental misunderstandings I think we have around gangs and organised crime. We're going to look at why this is important. And if we've got time, we'll look at working with gangs, but it's a short presentation, so we may not get there. Now, the one thing I'm really conscious of, actually, is that there's a lot of our friends from Australia and around the world are watching this presentation. And so I'm really conscious to explain a little more in slightly more detail around how the idiosyncrasies of the New Zealand, what the idiosyncrasies of the New Zealand scene are. Now, this starts, I think, in a really important way in 1960 in New Zealand, 1961 officially, but it actually happened in 1960. And that was with this pivot point that fundamentally changed the gang scene in New Zealand. It turned it on its head. And that was the emergence or the formation of a Hells Angels chapter in this country. Now, to put that into perspective, in 1960, there were only three chapters anywhere in the world, and all of those were in California in the US. So to have the fourth chapter established in Auckland is more than just a Trivial Pursuit question, actually. It's because it fundamentally changed our scene by bringing in some elements that meant that the gangs here could achieve longevity. Certainly the milk bar cowboy scene, as we called them, the young rebellious men that hung around riding motorcycles. But far, far more than that, it's influenced our street gang scene as well, which was predominantly Māori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. And so that our street gangs adopted the look and the hierarchical structure of the outlaw motorcycle gangs. So they wear back patches, they have that formal hierarchy of a president and a vice president, sergeant at arms and the like. And what this means for what this meant for New Zealand was that that our street gangs developed very early an organisational structure that allowed them to be perhaps more sophisticated than many street gangs around the world at their earliest formation. And this fundamentally changed the scene in New Zealand. And the other thing it did, and continues to do actually, is that it gives the New Zealand gangs a very high degree of visibility. So they're very visible within communities. They've got the back patches on. This is often accompanied by facial tattoos and the like. So we see our gangs. It's very, very clear who they are. Now, for decades really of the gang's existence from the 1960s right up until 1996, which I'm going to talk about why 1996 very specifically shortly, that the gangs existed for reasons other than organised crime, without question. They were heavy drinking, into violence, and in fact, the way they dressed in what they called the ridgies, their original clothing that they never washed, they were ripped and tattered. reflected the fact that they wanted to drop out of society. They weren't interested in pursuing mainstream goals. In fact, they were just a rebellious subculture that formed. And the concerns around them in New Zealand were very much focused on the idea of violence and disorder. They fought one another. They had very public brawls, constantly attacking one another. And also around sexual violence. So blocking, as it was called in New Zealand, it was gang rape, it was part of the culture. And these were the concerns that, quite rightly, worried the country for really the first half of the gang's existence in this country, or patch gang's existence in this country. Anyway, and then something quite remarkable happened. And it happened during a unique election year in New Zealand. 1996 was an unusual election year for New Zealand. We had adopted mixed member proportional electoral system, so we would change the way we voted, which gave smaller parties a chance of entering parliament, which they did. And during this election campaign, sparked by some gang violence, the gangs were ironically sparked by gang violence, because actually the gangs were suddenly reframed very, very quickly to be seen as organised crime groups. And it happened damn near overnight. And the rhetoric that surrounded this was quite remarkable. So there were stats thrown around at various times. 90% of the drug crime is dominated by the gangs. And one politician summed it up really succinctly, actually. The opposition MP, Mike Moore, said, gangs are no longer a bunch of thugs who smash up the occasional pub. We're now talking about serious organised crime. And so damn near overnight, the focus of the country shifted entirely from the gang, if not entirely, to a very, very large part, from the gangs being about disorder and violence to being about organised crime. And in this instance, at least, organised crime will pin down to being drug crime, their involvement in the illicit drug trade. Now, did this really bear up to facts? Like the idea that the gangs monopolise the drug trade, those are the players that absolutely dominate the drug trade in New Zealand. Well, potentially not. And in fact, I'll show an example here that came about before the 2014 election, where the government, and it's interesting, and I'm sure this is no different anywhere in the world, certainly not in Australia, I know, that often the bikies that are the big concern of of many politicians in Australia, we tend to talk about them, or at least they tend to be talked about a whole lot on the hustings. So each electoral cycle, we tend to hear far more about the gangs in New Zealand than we do at other times. And so it's unsurprising that this example comes before the 2014 election in New Zealand, when the government announced that we had a serious gang problem, and they had the answer to solving that problem. And so based on their the rollout of the policies that they were going to enact, they said that there were around 4,000 gang members in New Zealand, patched gang members, and they were responsible for a really significant portion of a whole range of crimes, as we can see there. So, but for our purposes, because we're talking about the drug trade, and that's predominantly how we talk about the gangs in New Zealand, we really just need to look at the 34% of Class A and Class B drug dealing offences. What we're going to do with these data, we're going to show what was said about what they claimed to be and what the reality of them was. And you'll just have to take my word for it that what we're going to do with the 34% of Class A and B class drug dealing offences is reflected in the lot. In fact, I will show that now, think about it. But the only other one to look at, because these data were collected over a 3-month period. So the government said, we've collected these data over a 3-month period, and this is what the gangs, these 4,000 gang members, are responsible for. Interestingly enough, although I didn't know it at the time, the bottom line there, the 25% of homicide-related charges, for reasons that I'll get to were counted over an entirely different 3-month period. And I do hasten to say, and I appreciate that what this conference is about, but these data did come out of the police. But I'm very quick to point out that the problems that I'm about to identify, I simply don't believe would occur now. And I believe that because there are some changes in the organisation, the advent of the evidence-led policing team, but also just changes to the top of the police hierarchy that I think mean they are far less likely for what I'm about to explain to occur again. Now, when I saw these data initially, I looked at them and I thought, well, 34% of Class A and B class drug dealing offences, that's really interesting because a lot of the rhetoric that was used to describe the gangs had always been about them overwhelmingly dominated, 90% and things like this, just figures that had sort of been thrown around. So I sort of thought, well, actually, to many of the public, it's entirely possible that they see that 34% of Class A and B class drug dealing offences is slightly low, if anything. But I thought it looked high. And one of the reasons I was really concerned was that when these data were released by the police minister, she also said that 28% of the prison population were gang members. So while I don't know how at that time, didn't know how these data had been collected, I could make some logical assumptions based on the numbers that we knew. So we know very specifically how many people are in prison at one time in New Zealand. And so if we calculated the 28% of the prison population at that time, it would have meant that there was only about, if there's 4,000 gang members, it would mean that there was only about 1,600 gang members on the street. And anyone with even an elementary understanding of the gang scene knows that not half of New Zealand more than half of New Zealand gangs are incarcerated at any time. I mean, it's a million miles from that. So I did what any mature and academic would do, and I said, if Anne Hollier, the police minister, has got her these figures right, I will apologise to her and I'll eat a suitcase full of carrots outside the sociology department at the University of Canterbury, which was a silly thing to say, not least of which because if I'd been wrong, I would have been bloody bright orange bright red, embarrassed, and then bright orange from eating bloody 2,000 carrots. But nevertheless, I was pretty confident that I was right. So I requested the data that how these numbers had come about, at least the basis for them. And I was told the basis for them was very, very different to that had been outlined by the police minister. And indeed, those data, so that 34% of Class A and B class drug dealing offending wasn't just the 4,000 gang members, it was 4,000 members and their prospects. Now, I don't think we can quibble too much with that. Prospects, for people who don't know, are those that are actively seeking to be recruited into the gangs. That's 4,000 members plus their prospects. I think we can live with that. But it wasn't 4,000 gang members plus their prospects. It was 4,000 gang members, their prospects, plus anyone who had been charged with a gang member for the same offence. So if there had been 4 people caught in a drug bust and one was a gang member, all 4 were counted in those gang data. So suddenly we haven't got just 4,000 gang members, their prospects and prospects, but also all of those charged in all of the activities of any gang member. But it didn't end there either. Suddenly we had anyone who had an identified familial tie with a gang member, meaning that if somebody committed an offence, say a Class A or Class B drug dealing offence, and their brother was in a gang, then they were counted in those data as well. So suddenly we've got 4,000 gang members, their prospects, anyone charged with a gang member, and anyone who had a family connection to a gang member, but it didn't end there either. It also, anyone who had an identified connection to a gang member, which, by the way, would include me, through my research. So, look, all of a sudden, we weren't talking about 4,000 people responsible for the 34% of Class A and B class drug dealing offences. We were dealing with an entire community of people. And, of course, it speaks to a couple of things. Firstly, the reason that the homicide data that I said had come from a different a period, they counted that over a different period. The reason for that was because if they'd used the same period as the other data, the figure was too low, and so they got it from another data set. So there was a manipulation of the data to help prove the problem. Now, if we're talking about evidence-led policing, we want the data and the best facts that we've got to drive the policy agenda. I'm not going to be telling anybody listening to this anything new there, of course, but in this instance at least, what we had was when the data conflicted with the common assumptions, we didn't change our assumptions. We indeed changed the data. So some real problems, but again, I'm really quick to add, and I don't say, and I wouldn't say this if I didn't mean it. I don't believe that would occur in the current environment, but certainly that's where we came from, and this has had some consequences, and the consequences really are that there is an overwhelming belief in New Zealand that the gangs are utterly monopolised the drug trade in New Zealand. And this has had, I would argue, really significant implications for both policing and for policy. So where are opportunities? Well, there are many actually, but to... Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. Actually, I'm so sorry. I didn't say what the numbers actually were. So out of this case study, that 34% of Class A and B class drug dealing offences dropped to 4%. So that's not a small sniff. That is a really significant change in those numbers, and all of the others changed substantially. And again, that 25% of homicide-related charges. Why did they get it? This is the 25% that I've used here is from the same 3-month period as all the other data. The reason that they didn't change that was changed was because it didn't show anything, so the data was changed. So again, this has led to some issues, but there are some opportunities, I think, and the opportunities arise if we choose to see the gang scene in New Zealand, for what it is. Now, the two fundamental misunderstandings that I think our approach, and I think the pressure to change sort of data, because we're just so convinced of how this works, that we were prepared to change data, is because we don't understand the scene at all well. And it's based on two fundamental misunderstandings. The first is that the gangs dominate drug dealing in New Zealand. And I think we can demonstrably prove that's not true. And also as the other is the nature of the types of dealing that the gangs, or the way that the gang drug dealers within the gang scene operate. And I'll just start with that because it's really important. And I think in the public mind, there's the idea, and in fact, within many who create policy, in fact, almost universally actually, there's an idea that there's a chapter of a gang, let's say there's 10 people, not just for to make it nice and easy, that there's 10 people, they sit around a table, the president of the gang is at the head of the table, and he's got a gavel, and he's saying we're selling this amount of meth this month, you're, pointing to his members, you're sorting out supply, and you're going to do the distribution, you've got the muscle, X is doing the marketing, and then it's organised around the chapter as a crime group. Now, New Zealand gangs, when they were entering the drug trade, in the 1990s, did begin to operate like that actually, but for a couple of reasons they changed. And they changed because the Proceeds of Crimes Act came in and started to be used, and the Proceeds of Crime meant that if organised criminals were busted, then their assets could be taken off them, and that would mean the clubhouse and the gang situation perhaps, and it was seen as a threat to the organisational survival of the group. And like any organisation, gangs are concerned with organisational survival. But actually that was a slightly minor part. The more pressing concern for those who were involved in organised crime was the fact that if you were incredibly good at your trade, if you were a particularly smart criminal, then you were looking around your chapter and you were seeing people who couldn't keep their mouths shut. They were always talking out of turn at the pub and releasing secrets that nobody needed to know. Perhaps they were too violent or just never smart enough that they would be baiting police when they had product in the car, or just drawing unnecessary attention. And perhaps most of all, that there were people in the groups who were simply bone idle, lazy, and suddenly you're sharing the profits. The group's sharing those profits. The smart guys are having to deal with all of these idiots, making it far more risky. They're not pulling their weight, and they're having to share the profits. So what happened was that, for want of a better term, the operations privatised. So no longer was it the purview of the gang for those who did enter, like some never ever did. It would be that, so around our 10-person chapter, there might be 3 people who are involved in their own little clique of organised crime. So they're a little syndicate on their own. There might be another 2 that are on a clique and a syndicate all of their own. And the others are really no more criminal than the communities within which they exist. So it's a fundamental misunderstanding that we've had, that the gangs operate as these mafia or crime groups as collectives, whereas in reality, the organised crime groups make up parts of the gang, and only certain parts of the gang at that. So how do we build a slightly clearer picture here with that idea in mind? Well, we're aware, of course, that organised crime is a very big thing and involves far more than just the drug trade. If we think about flora and fauna trafficking, or overfishing, or human trafficking, all of these things. But let's just concentrate for purposes here on the drug trade. So regardless of how significant the gangs are, the organised crime that surrounds the drug trade is very, very big, and the gangs are just players in that particular industry. And so I think it's important to note also that the different gangs have different levels of involvement. So at its extremes, and the extreme is really only used to sort of for purposes of highlighting a point, really, because there aren't too many that fall into these extremes. But on the one extreme, you've got a gang there that is completely involved in organised crime, maybe actually operating like that mafia type, that might be highly organised and run as a collective, or it might just be that all of their members are up to their necks in significant organised criminal activity. On the other extreme, you've got gangs that are really not. That there might be a bit of subsistent dealing, or just deal to your mates, or nothing serious. And again, they're no more criminal than the communities within which they exist. So if you took the average gang member and the average person of the same socioeconomic status, and they would be somewhere in that vicinity. Now, a more accurate sort of view of them, I think, so we're not on the extreme examples, is that here we can see that there's, in one example, there's a relatively small number of people in the group that are highly criminalised, and the others aren't, and another where many of the members are. And that's what most chapters of gangs look like. So there's some people involved and some people not, and depending on the chapter, there's either a lot or a little of that. That tends to be how it looks, rather than you're either all in or all out. And this can change over time. This can significantly change over time, in fact, because a gang that is, with members that are highly criminalised may, in fact, have a large bust, and it might knock out the leadership and the serious players involved, and so then the group becomes less criminal. Or there may be even things that aren't external pressures, but in fact internal drivers that change the degree of criminality. So a change in leadership, for example, can have really significant implications for how the group deals in organised crime and the number of members that do. If the president is highly criminal, chances are the rest of the chapter will be as well, and vice versa. So we tend to see, I think, that the gangs overlap. So it's not only do they not operate on their own as a collective, but when the members are involved in organised crime, often that's with other gang members and then with outsiders as well. So these cliques within the groups aren't just purely gang, but perhaps involve other gangs or outsiders as well. And when I talk about outsiders, often these are people who may be doing the same thing the gangs are, slinging it, being the muscle, all of that sort of, all of the sort of the basics. But importantly, also include those who are importing, and particularly in New Zealand, much of the meth, which would be the most significant issue in New Zealand, significant drug issue in New Zealand, is important. So there's international connections, which are incredibly important, that may be linked to organised crime groups that certainly aren't patched. But also those that may be assisting the gang to launder money, for example. So there are, people that are nowhere near looking patched, but who are heavily involved in the drug trade. So the better view of it, hands down, in my opinion, is that it looks like that. So you've got a number of people that are in the gangs, and then outsiders as well. And so you might say, well, what does this really mean? Is this just an academic sort of view of it? Like, who really cares? Well, it actually matters a lot, and it matters a lot for some important reasons. And that is that when police have limited resources to tackle these types of issues, which clearly they do, if you make this a gang problem, anyone in light grey there that you're tackling, that you're targeting, is just a complete waste of resource. It's not someone, when you're talking about serious organised crime, it's just not a resource that you need to be looking at. And perhaps even more importantly than that, I think in New Zealand we have fallen into a trap, really, that we've put blinkers on and looked so hard at the gangs that other players within the organised crime scene have been given a pretty easy run. And I use the example that when I was in the scene studying the gangs, I spent about 8 years in the field with the gangs, living with them and doing an ethnography. One of the biggest drug dealers I knew lived not too far from where I did, actually, up on Cashmere Hills, a very nice suburb, and looked like me. Didn't have any involvement with the gang. And I think, and for good reason, because the chances of him getting caught were very, very slim if he kept his arm's distance from the gang. So not only does it ensure that we are targeting the resource toward the right gang members, but it opens up those blinkers to ensure that we're actually looking at others as well, who in many, many instances will be far bigger and more significant players than those that wear patches. And I think at its most simplest level, and actually, if someone's timing me here, I think I'm just about to run out of time. At its most simple level, what this requires, in my opinion, is if we're talking about gangs, and there's very good reasons to talk about gangs, very good reasons to talk about gangs. And when it talks about gang violence and things, issues that are intrinsically gang related. But when we're talking about organised crime, and we mean organised crime, that's what we should talk about. Gangs and organised crime aren't synonymous, not least of which, because if we could snap our fingers tomorrow, and rid ourselves of every gang member in Aotearoa, the drug trade would dip, because the supply would dip for those players, those gang players who are involved in it, and it might dip even quite substantially, actually, but it would quickly recover through the basics of demand and supply. The drug trade and organised crime generally ought not be seen as synonymous with the gangs, and I think that very definition, if nothing else, is incredibly important to get our heads around. And with that, I'm really happy to open up for questions. I hope I've got my timing right there, team.
Jarrod, you're spot on. Thank you. Thank you very much. Timing is not an issue. So thank you again for that presentation. And we do have some questions, if that's okay. I'd like to put those to you on behalf of the audience, Jarrod. So the first one here refers to the National Gang List, or NGL, seems to have been used as a political football in recent times. How do you see the NGL developing over time, and how do you think it should be used? And would you agree that not everyone on the NGL is involved in criminality?
Yeah. Well, firstly, the National Gang List is a really important thing for police to have. It's a really important intel tool. It's good to understand the scene for when you're dealing with particular individuals, whether or not they have gang connections may have some impact on how you police them. So that's a perfectly valid thing to have, and it's an important thing to have. The way that it's being used here by politicians has been unfortunate, I would argue, because they're starting to use it um, in a way that lends itself to a degree of precision to the measurement of this, which is just not right. Now, it is a pretty good bellwether, and that's okay, but either way, the politicians are using it. But no, look, there's without question, there will be people quite rightly on that list for police purposes who aren't going to be the people we want to be looking at when it comes to serious organised crime. Plenty that are, but plenty that aren't as well. So it is a fairly, if we're talking about organised crime as it relates to drugs, it will be a very blunt tool without question.
Another question that's come in, Jarrod, given your knowledge and understanding of gangs in Aotearoa, New Zealand, what three things would you put in place across the social or justice sector to prevent and reduce harm caused by some gang members?
Gee, that's a really good question. I find myself in far better position to be throwing stones. I much prefer that than offering solutions. And I have my tongue in my cheek a little there when I say that. But the solutions are in some ways incredibly hard, in other ways incredibly basic, really. So I'll start with one that I think the police are doing actually pretty well, and that's around gang violence. When gangs are behaving in ways that their communities find completely unacceptable, that requires very strong policing and very surgical policing. You identify the groups that are involved and target them specifically. Let them know exactly why it's coming. They will know more often than not, but let them know exactly why it's coming. And the reason for that surgical nature is because if you target all gangs in that community when only one is the real problem, it doesn't modify behaviour. Right? That's just fairly straightforward. Now, from a prevention type standpoint, which is something that we don't address well in this country whatsoever, we see gangs as a law and order problem simply to be tackled by police. There are some fundamentals that we need to do. We need to appreciate why people join gangs, right? And if that's a need for income, which it is on occasion, a sense of status, a sense of belonging, that status frustration type ideal, we need to be able to provide young people with those things that the gangs are delivering. We have to recognise that the gangs provide a function. If they didn't provide a function, they simply wouldn't exist. So we need to be able to provide those things to young people to ensure, or to fortify them at least in some part from joining gangs when they could do something else. Not easy, but needs to be tackled. The other is, and again, this is rather large, is that the factors that produce gang membership in New Zealand are exactly the same things that fill our prisons. Now, we do not find the prisons filled with middle-class men who have had a good education and a fine upbringing. It just doesn't happen. They come from certain sectors where their lives have been riven with dysfunction, violence, overcrowded housing, intergenerational poverty, poor education, terrible health outcomes, drug and alcohol abuse, these usual suspects of malaise. Well, if we're not prepared to begin to tackle those issues for young people and families at risk, then we can't be complaining about the consequences, because when you have those social and economic factors in a society, in the same way that ingredients of a cake will bake at a given heat, the gangs are an inevitable result of those ingredients. So we, as basic as that kind of sounds, and I appreciate the complexities of tackling those, if we don't have a will to do it, we ought really have an ability to complain about the outcomes.
Jarrod, we've got another question, and we are running out of time, so I'll quickly put this question, and hopefully you'll be able to give a quick answer to it. It's from Sharina Murphy, I think it is, one of the audience, and thank you for the question. In relation to not all members being involved in crime, what are those members benefiting from that gang, and what is the motivation for them? It seems a fine line looking at preventative measures, re-criminality.
Yeah, look, I think there are probably two primaries, I think, that have existed across all of the gang's existence. I think in recent times there are people now joining because they see that they could potentially make an earn in the illicit drug trade. So that's fair without question. But there are a couple of others, and one is a sense of status. So if you don't feel that you are going to achieve status through any other means, if you put on that back patch, suddenly you can walk down the street with your chest out. You become somebody. So I think that is very important. But the other one, and hands down, this is absolutely critical. And that is fictive kin relations. That a form of family. They call each other brother, and in many instances mean it. But the reason that they're searching for that in the overwhelming majority of cases is because their own families have been so far from ideal that they're looking for a sense, the same social and psychological benefits that most of us get from family and friends, but they've just been bereft in certain lives. And the amount of times you hear stories of terrible family or whānau dysfunction that and people are simply searching for that. And again, if we ignore those drivers, then any measures that we put in place, I fear, are destined to fail, and certainly history would tell us that's right.
Thank you so much, Jarrod, for not only the presentation but also for answering those questions. It's clear the gang situation in Aotearoa New Zealand is complex. You've talked about those complexities, and we appreciate those. And also the more evidence-based approaches are required to support communities who suffer disproportionately from gang-related activities. So really appreciate your time. And now I'll hand over to Mark. Tēnā koe.
Kia ora. Thank you, Julian. And welcome to our three panellists. I'm going to call Dr. Gilbert Jarrod because I'm sure he would much prefer that. And Anthony, we've met today already, a colleague from the Australian New Zealand Society of Evidence-Based Policing Committee, and an important thinker actually in the evidence-based policing space. And my police colleague, Greg Williams, who I think must be on leave. So Greg, you are very welcome, and thank you for joining us. No doubt from home, I think, and great to have you here. So look, I think the three of you can offer some valuable insights into gangs and the way we think about gangs in communities. But I really wanted to start by building on Jarrod's presentation actually that took place in August. And actually, if we look at the landscape in the last 3 months, I guess, Jarrod, the visible presence of gangs in communities has attracted, for our international audience here in New Zealand, quite a lot of attention. There's been quite a lot of media focus on the visible presence of gangs and some commentary in respect of the COVID environment and the extent to which gangs have been impacted as part of that, or indeed a part of the problem or the solution. So I sort of wondered if you might just want to talk about how you think the gang environment might have changed in the last 3 months, and whether you think there are particular features of the current environment which has sort of changed the landscape here.
I think there are some lessons that we can take out of the last little period, actually. And for international guests, welcome, of course. New Zealand gangs do have a very high degree of visibility. Our street gangs here tend to wear back patches like the outlaw motorcycle clubs do internationally, so they have got a real visibility. And so when they do get together, it's very obvious who they are and what they are. So that's the basis. But I think the one really interesting thing for me during COVID, and particularly in very recent times, in the last couple of 3 months, is that this period has highlighted to us that in so many ways, the fate of the gangs and the fate of wider society are entwined. And so if the gangs aren't getting vaccinated or doing the right things during this period, then it impacts so greatly on us all. And I think that in so many ways should be a lesson for us, because it's not the only place where this exists, of course. I think if we talk about domestic violence, there's areas there that we could work alongside the gangs to assist in domestic violence, because if the kids and the partners are looked after, that's going to make healthier communities. I think if we look at education to ensure children are going to school well fed, being read to, and just getting the care that they need to set them up in life, then whether it be through vaccinations, through family violence, or through education, if we can work with the gangs to get those things right, then the whole community will benefit. And the one thing that is really inhibited, I think, or has made very difficult the vaccination within the gangs and within their whānau and communities, is the fact that our links into them perhaps aren't as strong as we would quite like them to be. And I think if we can build on the links that exist, and actually in some areas these are coming directly from the police, if we can work on those links and then work on them with these other areas where we would have mutual interests, then I think we will all be the better for that. And I genuinely hope that we don't just revert and to think too commonly about gangs as just a law and order issue, because in so many ways there are other issues and other agencies that need to be interacting with them in positive ways. And I genuinely hope that's a lesson that we've learned in the last couple of 3 months.
Jarrod, in terms of the opportunity, or do you think actually this is going to be a problem, and actually this is a situation where the situation is actually going to get worse before it gets better? What are you optimistic?
Was that at me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Am I optimistic? Look, I think when you work within the gang sphere, the one thing you definitely don't want to be is optimistic, because it's an area that's rife with disappointment. And indeed, I think even many of the gang leaders, particularly the pro-social ones, would say that. But there are some good things happening, and I think when we are interacting with the gangs, we are having a positive impact. My concern is that sometimes when those positive interactions are reported in the media, then there's an enormous community backlash. And so I think operating in these ways, which, and make no bones about it, working alongside gangs is going to be difficult, and it is going to come with disappointment, and often the hand that feeds them will get bitten. But I think if we work strategies towards common goals, things that if changes are made in the short, medium and long terms, this community will be far better for it, not just the gang community, but the wider community. Then when those controversies come, and they will come, whether they're warranted or not, there needs to be bravery in that, in the policy approach, and to hold the line to ensure that we get the outcomes that we need. It's not a popular and it's not an easy area to work in, but I think if you're talking about domestic violence and education, these are very solid common goods that everyone would agree with, that the gangs will welcome in many instances assistance with, and actually drug cessation might be another, that we can make some really positive, some positive impacts. And if we can, then we should.
Okay. All right, thank you, Jarrod. I'm going to turn to Greg. So Greg is one of New Zealand Police's most experienced detectives, heads up our National Organised Crime Group, and probably has the best operational understanding of the gang environment from a law enforcement point of view. Greg, you might want to respond to Jarrod, but I wondered if you wanted to start by just talking about the gang environment in New Zealand and maybe briefly the way it looks from a law enforcement policing point of view.
Well, it's very dynamic, and as you pointed out, Mark, changing quite rapidly. I am incredibly experienced in the sense that I've probably been policing the gangs now since the early 80s. So I kind of know what the gangs look like pre-methamphetamine arriving in the country around about 2000 to what it looks like now. And even in probably since 2014, there's been quite a dynamic shift in the way in which gangs operate. And really, a lot of that actually, if we just think around some of the reasons that gangs operate are around creating profit, power, and influence. And methamphetamine has been that gift and that golden gift, really, in terms of being able to create quite significant profit for the gangs. Money that they were never going to make ever before meth arrived, really, in New Zealand. Mainly methamphetamine is the drug of choice here. Some MDMA, very little in the way of cocaine, and virtually no heroin here in New Zealand. But methamphetamine was a drug that the gangs discovered that they could actually sell into very vulnerable communities right across New Zealand and virtually entrap people in this addiction cycle. That gave them significant profit, and with profit comes significant ability to corrupt systems by corrupting people in those systems. But the really intriguing thing, Mark, that I've seen that I really hadn't seen before was the power and influence that these gangs now control over these communities. But because they're basically addicting large amounts or large swathes of the community. So, if we took up somewhere like Kaurau, where obviously we did the Operation Notice, between 400 and 600 people in a town of 6,000 were addicted to methamphetamine. So that was something that, I'd never seen before. It was creating massive trauma for the community, for iwi in those communities, and for police trying to understand that, and also even down to councils and that to try and cope with what was taking place. So that was quite different. Probably the other thing that's happened. I mean, we're quick to say that, through Australia's decision to deport some of its influential gang members out of Australia, some of which came to New Zealand, that's made a significant change in New Zealand. And, well, it has, but there aren't huge numbers of the deportees that have come back here. They're actually organised crime offenders, but the ones that came back really were at the top echelon in Australia too, and they significantly changed the way in which gangs operated and functioned here very quickly, professionalised them, a lot more use of encrypted applications, connections into international transnational organised crime groups and supply lines. Really incredible use of social media. The gangs have got exceptionally good at selling themselves on the internet. The use of bling and flash vehicles and a lot of money. That is attracting young kids. That's seen an increase in what we would deem the Australian gangs, the rebels, the Mongols, the Comancheros, the Finks are now trying to establish here. All those gangs have now spread across here to New Zealand, and part of that reason is because of that ability to make money here by selling primarily methamphetamine. So that's created real tension here in New Zealand because they're jamming in what was already a tight sort of gang scene in terms of control of the markets. That's seen also an incredible increase in the number of gang members here. And then we've seen, really outward violence in communities where the gangs start to attack each other. Quite a significant violence going on there. And a lot of that's about territory, to be honest, and controlling the markets. Jarrod talks too about the impact on them as well. Methamphetamine has had a major impact actually on the gangs too, and on gang members and addiction. It's a very hard drug to get off, and we're seeing a lot of people being attracted now into gangs who are getting trapped in there themselves. So we have to really do think about the health-based initiative type opportunities to support our communities, but also those people now entrapped in gangs. is probably a quick summary of it.
Yep. Thanks, Greg. I'm going to turn to Anthony just to talk a little bit about, you've heard a couple of perspectives from New Zealand, Anthony. Your sense of how the Australian gang environment is either similar or different to the way it looks in a New Zealand context. And I guess a bit of a follow-on question about the extent to which there's been a kind of gang component to the COVID situation in Australia or not. So maybe you'd like to comment.
So Greg obviously mentioned outlaw motorcycle gangs, which is obviously, when we speak about gangs in the Australian context, is a major focus. And certainly for our work as the research team at the ALC, that's where our focus has been, and probably what I can comment most about. But of course, it's not the only, or it doesn't capture the entire gang environment in Australia, as we've seen most recently with the murders of 4 members of the same family in Sydney. So we currently have, I think it's 38 outlaw motorcycle gangs in Australia, and something like in the region of 6,000 members, including around 1,000 prospects. I think, with the kind of discussion around the involvement in organised crime, Greg talked about methamphetamine, and I think there's little doubt that in the Australian context, OMCGs are involved in, or a major player in those particular markets in terms of importation of methamphetamine, local production, and distribution. And so most people will be aware of the AFP-led Operation Ironside. I think something in the region of a third of the arrests made were of OMCG members in terms of the Australian arrests. And there were certain gangs that were particularly prominent in that. So the involvement in organised crime is similar in many ways, and I think fairly well established. I think where the debate exists, and this touches a lot on what Jarrod was talking about in his presentation, is the extent of that involvement. So, is it individuals within gangs that are involved in organised crime? There's kind of so-called rotten apples. Are there groups within clubs that are actually responsible for organised crime, or is it the clubs themselves operating as what we might call criminal organisations? And I think, people try and come up with it's this or it's this, but I think the reality is it's kind of a bit of all three. So we've done some analysis that's shown around, I think 1 in 8 OMCG members has been recently apprehended for an organised crime type offence. Most of that is illicit drug distribution, but this is really clustered in both chapters and gangs. So there's frankly a lot of chapters which have very little, if any, recorded history of recent organised crime offending. But there's a small group of chapters and also gangs that account for a disproportionate amount of organised crime and associated harm. So it's really clustered. And we know there are gangs where there's both patched members and office bearers who've been involved in organised crime offending. But I think there's probably a growing recognition that it's kind of at the chapter level that's the most interesting and important unit of kind of analysis, because it's those chapters that are operating, be it independently or within their network of other chapters within the gang, or even across gangs or with other groups. So that's a really important focus. The other thing I'd say, and in terms of kind of the idea of changing and evolving, is we've talked about Nike Bikey since I think the late 2000s in the Australian context, but it's kind of been hard to sort of test or demonstrate this empirically. So it was really interesting recently to unpack this kind of cultural change with some research we did with QPS, where we interviewed former OMCG members. And I'll come back to this later, but these former members, they and I think it has a lot to do with the growing involvement in things like methamphetamine. There was a major shift that they described from a kind of to a much more entrepreneurial focus that was profit driven, and a move away from kind of the traditional values and emphasis on brotherhood and loyalty that I guess has characterised OMCGs in the past. So there is a movement and real transformation in groups, which is, I think we've known that for several years, but it's becoming really apparent, particularly within the context of methamphetamine.
Thanks for that, Anthony. Now, just briefly, because we are, there's a clock against us here. New Zealand has something called a national gang list. It's been something that has been developed as an intelligence tool actually here to help us understand the gang environment. Fair to say the New Zealand audience will know that it's become both contentious politically and in the media, and has resulted in quite a lot of debate here. Jarrod's been helping New Zealand Police with some of the thinking about the list. Jarrod, I wondered if you just wanted to say a few words about the strengths or limitations of the list, and then I might just ask Anthony to comment on how it compares to the way that the list works in Australia, because there might be some opportunities in that. So Jarrod, just briefly, the national gang list, problem or opportunity?
So look, the national gang list is an important tool. I think if you're talking about intelligence and understanding the scene, it makes perfect sense as a tool for the police to have that. The slight issue we've got is a methodological one, that keeping account of such a large database is quite difficult. And I would argue that getting on that database is relatively easy, although they've made it much more difficult. There needs to be some checks and balances before a name is added, which I think is very important. But it's very difficult to get off the list because, identifying somebody in a patch will be relatively easy for someone in law enforcement. And again, the fact that our gang members predominantly wear patches should be something that's celebrated by law enforcement because it certainly makes the job a little easier. But getting off the list, if someone leaves the gang, that's much, much harder for law enforcement or for police to identify. And therefore, my concern is that the numbers going in can flow in relatively easily, but the numbers coming out, not so much, creating a sort of a bottleneck. So the list grows far bigger than it probably ought to be because it's not being deflated at the same way it's being inflated. And of course, this has become incredibly politically problematic because as the list has become more important to police, it's become more public and it's been used as a political football in really unfortunate ways, I would argue.
Anthony, there's a national gang list in Australia, I believe. You might just want to comment on that. And then I think Queensland have a gang exit strategy, I think. You might just want to say a word about the extent to which that's a useful tool or not.
Sure. So I mean, frankly, Greg probably knows more about the National Gangs List in the Australian context than I do. But the National Gangs List is managed by the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, and we have a system, obviously, slightly different government structure where we have the states and territories who are essentially inputting data from their own intelligence systems into the NGL. So that, I think, offers a level of protection and a chance to address issues around, obviously, duplication, giving gangs mobility across and gang members mobility across borders, and other opportunities to address data quality issues. And that sort of sits within the infrastructure of the kind of national task force, Morpheus, that's responsible for OMCGs. And I know there's been a lot of effort in the last couple of years, at least, certainly, to improve the quality of the information that goes into that system and the quality of the information that's held by each of the police agencies as well. Now, there's absolutely still similar sorts of issues that Jarrod described in his presentation and now, which is kind of once you move outside of the core group of patch members and prospects, the quality of the data around things like associates becomes variable. There's different rules around who goes on and who doesn't. And there's obviously an ongoing challenge and debate around kind of what to do with former members. Do you take them off the gang? Or take them off the list? Are they important to keep on the list from a kind of surveillance, particularly given some recent work we showed something like a third of former gang members were approached by another gang and tried to be recruited back into OMCG. So there's a role there for, I guess, sort of surveillance of former members in some respects. Having said that, I don't think we've seen, or certainly I've not observed, the same level of kind of political kind of football around the numbers on that group. I know there have been in some jurisdictions historically, but we've not seen, it quoted as the be all and end all of kind of gang membership. So I suspect that's probably not necessarily become as a bigger problem.
Anthony, this might be an unfair question, mate. I apologise. Do you know how many people work on that list in Australia? Like how many? You may not, mate. So I apologise for putting you on the spot. But do you have any sense of what sort of resource it takes to keep that up and running in Australia?
So I don't know the current situation. Certainly when working with AGIC in the past, so the Australian Gangs Intelligence Coordination Centre, I probably got that wrong, sorry. But there was a small team that was responsible for kind of the national collation of that information. But of course, then you've got all of the police agencies who provide the data and do their own data cleaning. And I think there's absolutely jurisdictions that are better than others in terms of keeping that up to date, just from a resourcing point of view, particularly. I think, I genuinely think there's real value in compiling. I mean, there's obvious intelligence value. We've been able to work with ACIC and Task Force Morpheus members to use that data to understand patterns of offending, looking at things like criminal mobility, changing in offending careers. And now we're moving to using it using state-based systems to develop prediction tools and the kinds of things that are really prominent in other areas of law enforcement that perhaps haven't been as widely used in the Australian context. In the OMCG context. So I do think there's real value there.
Anthony?
I think, Mark, the other point of your other question was around the exit program, which is a bit of a kind of a complete shift away from the NGL. But I think that's a really promising kind of move in terms of the response to OMCGs. Really briefly, so the exit program was established, I think, or launched in 2020. It's led by Queensland Police Service, or established by Queensland Police Service, particularly Detective Chief Superintendent Roger Lowe. Shout out to him for all of his work in setting it up. And it's a partnership between police, corrections and community organisations, and it's designed to help motivated former OMCG members stay out of gangs. So essentially the QPS acts as a referrer, so they screen and refer individuals who are formally disaffiliated from an outlaw motorcycle gang into community organisations who then provide services, and they might be things like health services, mentoring services, employment and so on. And this was inspired by some of the Scandinavian approaches to OMCGs, particularly in Denmark. But I'll just end by saying one of the things that was really important there, and the reason we got involved in doing some research to support it, was the recognition you can't pick up a program from Denmark and plonk it in Australia and think it's going to work. So there was a lot of investment in building an evidence base to help support the design of that particular program.
Okay, team, this should have been a 60-minute session, let me tell you, because we've only scratched the surface of what's possible, and I apologise that we weren't able to get to a whole range of things. We're going to have to do this again, I think, frankly. But look, can I thank the three of you for your contribution, and hand back to Julian and Anaru just to close this particular session.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to the panel. Really appreciate your time and the insights that you have provided as well. I am going to ask Superintendent Andrew Pewhairangi to make an online presentation to you, given that we couldn't be together in person, but to reflect not only on the presentation you just given, but also its alignment to the whakatauaki, the proverbial utterance of New Zealand Police that he will offer to you now. Anaru, tēnā koe.
Greg, Anthony, Jarrod, aku rangatira, tēnā koutou. It's my great pleasure to gift to you virtually the whakatauaki from Uncle Api, one of our Māori elders from my tribe of Ngāti Pro, our tribe of Ngāti Pro, to you all today. If I think about the kōrero today for myself, I heard whānau for me. I heard us taking a different approach to not only the enforcement that we obviously know we need to do, but also as to how we might link in better with whānau and engage with whānau, their leaders and their children and future leaders of our countries. So I think from my understanding from Uncle Api is he asks us to stand at the stern of our canoes and to feel the spray of our future at our faces. And I think for myself, listening to your kōrero, there's a real holistic approach to people. And I think about COVID and the engagements that I've had alongside Deputy Commissioner Haumaha with our gang whānau, they feel marginalised. They feel like they don't have voice. They feel really disempowered by the impacts of COVID. And I really got a lot of hope from the kōrero that you presented to us today. And if I think about Uncle Api and that thinking, it really enables us to have a different conversation as our police service. So, nei rā tōku nei mihi kia koutou. Really appreciate the opportunity for us to bring prevention to the forefront. And I know, Greg, through the work that you've been leading holistically around the country, and also the thinking here, Jarrod and Anthony, look, really appreciative. I know Uncle Api would join me if he were here to say thank you for providing hope for our people and enabling us to build a better New Zealand, a better Australia, a better world together. Nei rā tōku nei mihi.
Kia ora, Anaru, tēnā koe, and thank you to our panellists again, and also thank you, Mark, for your facilitation of this session.